Hello and welcome back to Chat About It, Don't Shout About It with me, Rachel, the Queen of the Woke, as crowned by one of my haters. The Bobby is back. She is back. The bounce is back. She's looking great. She's a little bit short on the old fringe, but that's because I'm away at the moment on holiday. So I decided to get it done a bit shorter so I didn't have to take some scissors. Anyway, today is Doctor Who Sunday and we are making a start. And believe me, I say a start on the War Games, the epic 10-part story, which was voted by you, my subscribers. So thank you very much if you voted on that. To vote on the current poll, head on over to the community page. So the War Games was actually written by Terence Dicks and Malcolm Hulke. It was directed by David Maloney and it aired with an average overnight rating of 4.9 million people. That makes it the lowest rated in the average overnight score for Series 6. So, not the worst episode, but just the lowest rated in the overnight scoring. It aired between the 19th of April to the 21st of June 1969. The Doctor, Jamie, and Zoe land in the zone of World War One, no man's land. They are very quickly captured and, of course, they get court-martialed. They think that they are just in the normal war, but they later discover that something is amiss, so they start looking into it. They discover that the warlord or the warlords are playing games and pulling warriors from their own time zones into this one in order to conquer, well, the galaxy, the universe, the world. The Doctor, Jamie, and Zoe team up with a group of misfits that had fought off their processing in order to put a stop to it. However, the Doctor soon discovers that he can't fix it by himself and he has to call upon the Time Lords. The Time Lords then take the Doctor prisoner and put him on trial for his part in the War Games and other things. He is found guilty, sent into exile, and forced to regenerate. I will, of course, naturally, as it is a 10-parter, miss things out for this review. So please be sure to comment below. I'm breaking this down into 3 videos, and today we are looking at the story. So the hardest thing about reviewing the War Games is to know where to start, because unlike the Key to Time and the Trial of the Time Lord, this is not broken down into smaller stories within the story. Instead, it is actually one big story. So I thought that this week I would look at the story, then next week the performances, and then the pacing. Now, I will say, I think it was a very brave decision of the writing team, Terence Dicks and Malcolm Hulke, to actually do a 10-part story. We were all familiar with 4 parts and 6 parts. We've had the old 12-part as well. You know, I'm not going to go into that one just now. But by then, so to extend it must have been quite something. A really difficult feat with months of prepaid rehearsal and quite a big cast too. In actual fact, it was like less than 3 months, I actually think, from my research. Now, the risk of a 10-part story is plot holes everywhere. If you were around then, what did you think about getting a 10-part story? Did you find out that, well, did you find that it had a lot of plot holes in it? I personally, watching it through from start to finish, not back to back, but over a few days, I found it had very few plot holes that I could really pinpoint. And the only one that I could really, really pinpoint is the war chief does not regenerate when he dies. I don't know if that was intentional or if it was an oversight. I was half expecting him to regenerate because we know he's a Time Lord, or maybe at that point in time, the only decision had been made to regenerate the Doctor, so why would perhaps someone like the War Chief regenerate? Well, other than that, though, the story is actually pretty concise. Doctor Who was an educational sci-fi historical show, and the War Games is certainly one you can use as an educational factor. World War One, the Great War, is probably the most prominent war for us in the United Kingdom, along with World War Two. But anyway, that was back then in the 60s, and there would have still been servicemen alive from it, and a lot of people would have remembered it as well as civilians, and the UK was still fresh of World War II, and there hadn't really been sort of any significant war since then. But then, of course, we had wars that came later, like the Falklands and all of that. So, do you think that this story was a political allegory for war? Pulling the warriors from their different time zones and countries is very much like the World Wars. How the political leaders at the top strategically plan everything out as if it were a game to be played. We always talk about pushy messaging in today's Doctor Who, but the War Games is very much a massive message about war and the arrogance and the games that they play behind it. Although it is done in a much better way than what we have on TV today. On TV today, they just put something in with one jarring sentence instead of working it into the story naturally and making it part of the plot. This story does actually live up to the name of the show and its original premise. It's got the history with World War One, the Romans, American Civil War, the Jacobite Rising. So Jamie gets called a deserter. Now, of course, we know that Jamie travels with the Doctor, so we have to overlook it in that case. But the warriors in the War Games obviously don't know that. They actually think, he is from 1745. Now, Jamie gets called a deserter because they are captured within 3 minutes of the story starting and promptly court-martialed. We can't have a Doctor Who story without the trio being suspected of something or being captured in some way. It's a fail-safe plot point to Doctor Who. It is, however, in the War Games used far too much. Now, I'll set that aside because I think that's actually got more to do with pacing than anything else, and I'll cover that in a different part of the review. One thing that is very prominent in this story is that of hypnotism and processing. There's always something that you hear of in times of war. Are people being brainwashed, or are they hypnotized? Are they doing something because they are being made to do so? It is an unfortunate downside to war. So I think they toy with the idea a lot in this story, and I don't actually think they overuse it either, even though they could have run the risk of doing so. They progress it. They start off with the general hypnotism with the captain, and we are led to believe that it is just that at the beginning, as it happens several times throughout to very convincing effect. They use these glasses a lot, so we believe that the hypnosis comes from these glasses. It's not actually until episode 4 that we discover it's something much more sinister about the whole entire game. Soldiers get processed to make them believe that they are still fighting within their respective time zones, and that 5% need reprocessing because they are rebelling. This could be an allegory for brainwashing, as thought control in real life is a very real thing, and it's a way of covering tracks, so to speak. The character we see that with mostly is Carstairs. At the beginning, when we see him, he is very much part of the processing, but then the Doctor manages to break through it, and later when he is captured, we see him get reprocessed, and then capture Zoe only for it to be broken again. That also shows that Carstairs actually has a very strong mind indeed. The capturing of Zoe also means that we get to see a sci-fi torture device. I don't think they would have got away with that had it been something that we were familiar with. Otherwise, the watershed would have come into action much earlier than it actually did. This was used to great effect, actually, because it shows the power it has on a human's mind and how a human's mind has no choice but to crumble and to confess, even if it is not true, because torture affects someone's mental state as well as their physical state as well. Now, whilst it doesn't drive Zoe crazy, the truth machine does actually render her unconscious. However, the brilliance of this plot point shows us how powerful the Doctor truly is, because he is also subjected to the same torture method as Zoe was. The difference being was that it didn't make him tell. His sheer power or the control of his own mind meant that he could switch off just like that with no issues. And whilst it also briefly rendered him unconscious, he was able to get what he wanted, and that was a one-to-one with the war chief. So I have only mentioned the war chief at one point in this review so far, I think, but I think he is actually a really great character. He really is the first sign of a Time Lord gone wrong, the antagonist. I understand why people believe he is the master or the forerunner of the master. I also understand why they haven't brought him back for another story as of yet. I mean, what would you have him do other than the same sort of thing a few times? There would only be a few ways of reigniting it, and it's easier to do it with the master multiple times over and over, as he was always out to get the doctor and the war chief was not. Well, the war chief's goals were completely different. Now, the war chief knew the doctor, and did you actually figure out that they were the same race of alien when they recognized each other in episode 4? And did you guess it was the war chief given the warlord, Time Lord technology secrets? This straight up highlights the dangers of messing with time and giving alien races the power to mess with it. The war chief thinks he's doing the right thing. Invariably, most people who we consider to be bad think that they are doing the right thing when they're not. He thinks they will succeed. And in many respects, I think what the war chief is doing is actually a form of cowardice and greed. He clearly has, in my opinion, some kind of fear of the warlords and wants his power, so he works with them. He wants to be supreme galactic ruler. Is he manipulated? Yes, to a degree, but he was sure that he was going to get something out of it. He thinks the doctor will help him, and who believed the double cross when the doctor made it look like he was handing over his companions? I certainly was a bit shocked by that when I first watched it. Now, what I find amusing is that they want the Doctor's TARDIS. However, what they fail to realize is that the Doctor isn't an expert with the TARDIS. Whilst they knew he stole it, the Doctor isn't an expert at controlling it. And I often wonder if through the series, like in general, I'm talking about now, any tinkering that we see him doing that's not repairing it is him learning how to control it beyond what he already knows. It also made me wonder if, because of that, the doctor would have been able to have told them what they needed to know for the longevity of the war machines. Well, sorry, I say the war machines, the war game machine. Now, I think that he probably could have, because he's incredibly intelligent and he knows the danger of the technology, getting it into the wrong hands, and what that could do and what the warlord could actually do is incredibly dangerous. The warlords, or the warlord, is definitely an allegory for the commanders in chief, the politicians overseeing the wars, the ones who control the soldiers. They are not a race that was all too common in Doctor Who. They were used quite sparingly, in my opinion, because, like the war chief, truly, what else would you be able to do with them? I don't think we've seen them at all since the war games, actually, in the TV show. That anyway, I will cover the warlords a bit later when I talk about the pacing, because actually that is my biggest issue with the warlord. Now, I noticed that I've been calling them warlords, but we really don't have a name for them, do we? Because we only know the commander who is actually called the warlord, which was played by Philip Maddock, who was actually in The Brain of Morbius that we just reviewed last time. In many respects, I was secretly disappointed that the warlord wasn't a Time Lord. I remember when I was watching the story for the first time years ago that I wanted it to be the Time Lords in control of all of this. Listen, I don't know why I wanted that to happen, because it would go against the Time Lord code, so to speak, but I really liked the idea, so I was a bit disappointed that they were a different alien race. And that may be a bit selfish of me, I know. Maybe I also thought that because I knew this was the event that introduces the Time Lords anyway. Now, with the Time Lords, I would like to ask who is old enough to remember their first introduction. Who thought it was actually a good idea to introduce them and why? And who thought it was a bad idea to introduce them and why? I'm asking because I'm a wretched millennial who has only ever known the Time Lords to be in Doctor Who. Now, from my perspective, I've got no issue with it, with them being in the show, because, well, as far as I'm concerned, they're not really overused to a degree. I mean, they get used a fair bit, but not to the point where they get exhausted. The introduction of them sheds a new light into the show. I know that strictly here they truly are a plot device to move the Doctor along into the forced regeneration for the new era of the show. I think that the best thing that they did, though, was have it so that the Doctor has to get them involved, because later in the show, in the history of the show, it becomes an easy plot point to say that the Time Lords forced him to do something that actually they did in Brain of Morbius, actually, now that I recall. It showed that the Doctor even gets scared in the war games. He knew the impact that this was going to have on him, Jamie, and Zoe. It also shows that the Time Lords are something to actually be scared of in many respects, and they certainly were. The Doctor, Zoe, and Jamie are all fighting to get back to the TARDIS, but they get hit by a force field as the other characters disappear and are sent back to their own time zones. They do make it into the TARDIS, but it is a real struggle. And it shows us, if we think that the Doctor is powerful, then the Time Lords are even stronger than the Doctor. The Doctor, Jamie, and Zoe all end up on Gallifrey because of this. And we get to see the insides of Gallifrey for the very first time. Well, the prison cell and a courtroom, at least. This does show that the Doctor fears his own people. He had to run away with the TARDIS, and he knew that he had interfered when he shouldn't have, which goes against the Time Lord Code. However, it was his morals that actually made him interfere in the first place. He effectively surrendered himself because he was not able to resolve the situation that was going on with the war games without their help, and that is a big risk. We know that the Doctor does it for the greater good, and it makes the viewers see the Time Lords almost as a bad race because they don't interfere, or they didn't until they were introduced, because the war games is so barbaric in the Doctor's eyes that even he couldn't resolve it. And by the way, the Doctor is often seen as the hero, like 99% of the time he is seen as the hero. How did you feel this time when he couldn't resolve it by himself? They essentially make him an allegory for a war criminal, as they do with the warlord. They put him on trial and find him guilty. They then have their form of the Doctor being offed with regeneration. Almost a bit of ring theory going on there, because in episode 1, the cliffhanger is that the Doctor has been shot. He regenerate after being court-martialed? But unlike the 10th planet, we do not actually get to see the regeneration into John Pertwee. We get the regeneration of mutated, twisted faces, and his last lines are, "You can't do this to me, no, no, no," whilst falling out of sight and a much better performance than what I just done. Do what I just did. A terrible fate for the Doctor, who then becomes earthbound. Zoe and Jamie's endings are actually really sad as well. However, unlike Donna Noble, where she had all of her adventures wiped from her mind, Zoe and Jamie remember that one adventure that they had with the Doctor when they first met him. So at least the writers were kind in that respect. Not that RTD was actually horrible to Donna Noble. Donna Noble's storyline is actually my favourite from New Who, minus the current series. Zoe and Jamie actually got very clean exits from the story, very different from the "I've had enough" type of exits at this point, which we had become accustomed to. They were forced to leave, which I actually like. It is sad, like I said, but it was necessary because there was a new Doctor coming in and their contracts had expired. Well, actually, no, that's incorrect. I think Patrick Troughton had decided to leave. Fraser Hines' contract was expiring, and Wendy Padbury had decided as well, in addition, to leave and not actually come back for Series 7. The one thing that I will note with this, and I don't think Doctor Who really ever did this again until New Who, was that there was a time when the viewer was actually left with 0 companions and a new Doctor, so nothing to transition with. Were there complaints about not actually having any companions to transition with at the time? And I do wonder because they didn't really do it again until New Who, and they made a point of bringing the Brigadier back, who we had actually just seen like a few episodes before or something when John Pertwee took over. So we knew who the Brigadier was. So I'm going to mention a few things that I actually haven't spoken about yet. I really like the character of Lady Jennifer. I almost wish that she had stayed because I think with her demeanor and wit, she could have been a very nice adversary for the Pertwee Doctor. But I suppose with a 10 episode story, you eventually run out of things to do with the character. Now, Harper, played by Rudolph Walker, whom I absolutely love, is a great character too. And I really wish they hadn't have offed him so quickly. And the sonic screwdriver. Yes, we have to address the sonic screwdriver right now. It was used just 3 times in the whole 10 parts, twice with the German captain, and then once at the suggestion of Zoe because the doctor had resorted to sticky tape and scissors. I feel like the sonic would have been used close to about 200 times now in New Who. Well, maybe not Shoe Sonic, but definitely for the other doctors for sure. One of my favorite bits of the story, though, is when Jamie has been captured as a deserter and the doctor needs to break him out. In this day and age, the Doctor would just have whipped out the second worst prop in Doctor Who history, the psychic paper. However, in Classic, they didn't have that. The Doctor has to infiltrate the barracks with utmost authority, claiming to be from the War Office and wanting a layout of the prisoner base. He thinks of it on the spot and runs with it as much as he possibly could, and it works. He is able to break Jamie out of prison. Whilst it does take a fair chunk out of the episode, the Doctor's infiltration skills are absolutely brilliant. Now, all in all, The War Games is actually a brilliant story that uses history to educate the ins and outs of politics with war. A story with a message that was integrated and part of the story. I don't like jarring messages within Doctor Who, but in this case, it is very seamless and it means that I don't end up reading too much into it unless I'm writing a review, and I don't get distracted and I'm more enthralled by the story. Now, as to what actually makes this the lowest rated in the average overnight scores, it is possible that the audience did find it too long. The pacing, which we will get to, adds to it, and I think the repeat of the several plot devices that they used may have actually dulled it very slightly and didn't provide enough to hook the audience back in. It is also very military heavy, and maybe the era of war movies was starting to wear on the public, or maybe it was the time of year. Maybe it was that age old excuse of New Who, the weather. Philip Maddock, who very promptly became a regular on this show, was presented to us in the guise of the Warlord. Now, I find his performance very intriguing. In his other stories that he's actually done, he is very animated, but here he is not so animated. He has a striking air of authority in his entire performance, but he barely cracks variation in his facial expressions. It's almost a manic type of catatonic type of performance that makes him bonkers and weirdly mysterious at the same time. He is a character that is actually very hard to read. None of it is upstaging. He doesn't dominate, even though he is commanding the screen. There's a certain menace behind it, too. I'm glad that his menace doesn't actually upstage anyone, because whilst he is head honcho, so to speak, the War Chief is a much bigger character. The War Chief, played by Edward Brayshaw, not Bradshaw, as this Word document keeps telling me, he's a very well accomplished actor. The only thing that the War Chief runs the risk of doing is becoming a hammy type of performance. Now, he does not do that. He is actually quite scary at times. He doesn't have the air of menace, but he does have the air of wanting to domineer and conquer. There's no over the top performance here, in my opinion. He is commanding. You know he is in charge, and yet he shows us where he is breaking down and failing with a certain finesse, I think, actually. I will say that I'm one of those people who actually doesn't believe the war chief was the master. I believe he was the foundations behind the character because of Terence Dicks, and that's where the idea for the character comes from. But I think that is truly as far as it goes, because if he really was the master, then why didn't they just bring back Edward Brayshaw? Carstairs was played by David Saville. I wasn't sure if I was going to cover this character or not, but I chose to put him in because he's one of those few characters that was actually all the way through the story. A lot of the characters actually come and go, but he was a mainstay. And I think Carstairs was a much needed character in this. I believe so. There needed to be a character with an authority that wasn't an alien, but the Doctor needed to get through the time zones and fight off the enemy with. And this actually comes in the form of Carstairs and, of course, later the Resistance. Now, I wondered if David had been a military man himself, because of the way he holds himself throughout is something that I would have actually expected to see with that of a military man. For example, my cousin, he served in the Navy, and his stance is actually very upright, and he holds himself extremely differently from my brothers, uncles, and my dad. And well, obviously, that's just more of an observation, or maybe he is just that much of a sort of like good mimicker with body stance that he was able to pull that off. Now, he is a very fine actor. You can see the process, like here, look at this. It's going behind his eyes. You know what he's actually thinking and feeling at all times. It's almost like he truly became the character, very sort of method. He strips away himself and becomes Carstairs. Sometimes it's easy to tell, especially with children, when they are not fully connected with the character, and they are just going through the motions, as perhaps my old drama teacher would actually have said. That could be a simple lack of experience with something, or just not fully adjusting to what the character wants and actually desires. And at the end, I was really, really disappointed. I don't know about anyone else, but I was really disappointed that his character never actually got back to Lady Jennifer. The way the two performers interacted with each other actually made you believe they were from the same time zones, and that's also marks of very talented performers. Actors quite often for the first time meet and then they just act with no knowledge of the other person. Very little time to build a rapport, probably particularly back then as well, and to have the characters bounce off of each other. It's one of the reasons why we get screen tested quite a lot, actually. Fraser Hines is great in this story as usual. I feel like he actually plays Jamie a lot smarter in this story. His performance shows off a certain knowledge and understanding of what it means to actually be with the Doctor, especially at this point. There aren't so many of his like Jamie-isms where he makes mistakes for something or for something else, or misuses a word or something like that. Jamie is also actually in his forte of a military man because he's a Highlander. So that's something he can also use to his advantage. It gives Frasier that sort of extra status that he actually needs. Frasier plays Jamie really well. He uses just the right amount of inquisitiveness, but he also pushes forward the strong fighter and defender in his character for this story, more so than any other story he has done. And that's just my opinion there. Now, I actually quite like that because if you think about it, Jamie is a hero. He's a defender of his country, Scotland, but he also has his morals and that he stands with, and he doesn't let the war games get in the way of his morals. You even see that with his interactions with the only red coat that we actually see for the majority of the story until the end. That could have easily gone the wrong way with the writing, but they chose not to do that, and they had Jamie overcome it and actually be the better man. Wendy Padbury as Zoe Harriet is fantastic. Yes, I know I look like her. I thought I'd best say it because it's not the first time that the comparison has been made. I haven't inflated my hair as much as I normally do in order to try and look less like her. But it's a really nice comparison too. But I just thought I'd put a stop to that before it goes into the comments. You can say it if you want. I don't mind, but it's just that I know people make that comparison. Anyway, Wendy Padbury is quite charming, actually. She presents herself as a smart woman from the future. She plays her as she is written. I always have believed that, actually. She does that. Sometimes actors go in the other direction. She doesn't go against the grain with her character. I don't know, actually, if Wendy uses method acting or not with Zoe. It's actually quite tricky to tell. Now, my favorite part of her performance is actually her last scene. The amount of confusion she plays it with is spot on. It's like she made Zoe aware that something had happened just prior to the doctor leaving, but she's not entirely sure as to what it was exactly. I got the impression from that scene alone that if she had thought hard enough, she could probably break the memory wipe that the Time Lords had actually done on her. Now, I haven't forgotten the most important person, the lead, Patrick Troughton, who had decided that it was time for him to bow out with Doctor Who. It's a good thing that he did, actually. I think if he had stayed too long in the role, then I think he would have actually sabotaged himself. Now, that sounds really bad, but I often feel that was the case with Tom Baker. Now, the Doctor's final swan song is always his most saving grace hero moment, his biggest sacrifice. And his biggest sacrifice was handing him it all over to the Time Lords, knowing that he in turn would be in danger of their wrath. Patrick, who is very much a character actor, in my opinion, is in his prime with this story. Whilst the role of the Doctor is not really that for a character actor, it was a good choice to actually put him in the role because he brought something a little bit different compared to what we had with Hartnell. Now, Patrick does not actually go with the buffoonery that he sometimes uses with the Doctor in this. He steers himself away from it, actually. In fact, he tends to go for a more pensive Doctor throughout the story, whilst maintaining his grandfather type figure and his quick temper that he has as the Doctor, which was carried through from Hartnell. Now, for the most part, though, he chooses to go for the more pensive Doctor, as I've already said. I think he chose to do this so that the viewer would be shocked at the supposed double cross. And when it got to the episode where the Time Lords are introduced officially, then he could really fully let loose and go for it in his defense. The sheer anger that he demonstrates at the Time Lords for questioning his meddling makes you connect with him more than the Time Lords. The anger he demonstrates for forcing him to regenerate makes you truly sense his panic of not wanting to go. Now, I use the word demonstrates. I don't mean that Patrick is by any means doing any demonstrative acting. I really don't. I don't believe he does that at all. I'm just using it as a descriptor. He makes you understand that what he's facing is definitely the end of his Doctor, and that is scary. So I'm going to be very honest now. I think the story is way too long. This is one of my biggest gripes with the actual story itself. I think that by the time they got to the key to time and the trial of the Time Lord, they realized it's actually easiest to go with an overarching plot that is sort of the main sort of like thing with the mini stories in between. And that's often quite a device that is used today as well. Now, they could have done it with the war games. For example, they could have had it all set in the games as we have it, but had mini stories within each or some of the war zones instead of one long, complicated plot with the reveal of the warlord happening a lot earlier. I wrote in my notes that by episode 8, I'm starting to feel the length of the actual plot. I feel like the plot could have actually been consolidated down into the 8 episodes and the story would still have been completely fine. There is a good 4 stories where we see them doing the same thing over and over again with the military episodes. The Doctor, Zoe, and Jamie being captured, then being court-martialed to escape, and then have to have it happen all over again, and perhaps in a slightly different format than the one before. And I think it should have gone land in World War One zone, have 2 stories in World War One zone, and go into the Roman War zone and have 2 stories with them, rather than having them go back to the World War One on the German side zone. The overarching plot part could have actually been that the warlords were running these games. Well, I think in general it was anyway, but I think that they could have had this running from almost the very beginning, possibly even. Now, Doctor Who thrived on actually educating youngsters back then. So I think by spending too long in one war zone, they actually truly missed the chance to educate about other wars too. And this could have made the plot feel a lot quicker had they actually gone down that route and prompt with the differences in the history before adding the sci-fi. Now, I know I've already said it, but the warlord should have been introduced earlier too. I feel like that would have helped with the pacing of the story. There's a lot of talk about him prior to this, but there's no real shock factor when he is actually introduced, and the Doctor Who is actually very good at doing the shock factor. The Warlord adds a dynamic to the War Chief, so if he was introduced earlier, then we could have seen more of that dynamic actually play out and wonder who he actually was. Maybe there we see a more of a double cross or whatever. I don't know how they could have done it, but I feel like the introduction of the warlord would have actually sped the story up, made it a little bit more interesting than what it actually already is. Now, don't get me wrong, it's a very good story. I really do like it. There was just a lot of filler in between sometimes. And I think it was the earliest version of running down a corridor that we actually got. I do think, however, them getting into the time machines in episode 4 was just about right. But do they spend too long with the war chief and the warlord? I'm not really sure. Now, as someone who is more interested in the history of with Doctor Who compared to the sci-fi, I want to say yes, but at the time, I also feel like it's a no. At the same time, excuse me, as I feel like the majority of the war games actually takes place in the historical setting overall. There were also characters who were not in it for long enough, in my opinion. For example, Harper, I mentioned him earlier, a very intelligent, underrated character that has a very charming and I also think underrated actor, Rudolph Walker. I don't know exactly what they would have done with the character, but I think because they wrote out Lady Jennifer just after that, he could have actually taken her place for sure. Now, I think that part of the pacing issues with this is representative of what was actually happening at the time. I had a look into it as I wondered if there was something that actually could have easily affected it. It would appear that discrepancies had arisen in that time, and it was due to the fact that there was dislike for Malcolm Holt's stories and, you know, Derek Sherwin's stories. So they made a decision because they couldn't decide on the stories to put the last 10 remaining episodes into one block instead of breaking them into, I think it was like something like 2. And in order to prevent the story from losing its momentum, they added the war zones. And also at the time, they had, in addition of Patrick choosing to leave, Frasier's contract was actually expiring. And the fact that Wendy had also decided to leave at the end of the war games, they couldn't convince her to stay for Series 7. Plus, they also had the suggestion from Derek Sherwin to actually introduce the Time Lords into the story as well. There was also a very unusual decision of writing the first 5 parts before writing the conclusion of the story. Normally, every author that I've spoken to at least has the end goal already in mind, but they didn't do that with the war games. Now, the added zones I actually feel didn't slow the momentum down per se, but I think they should have played with the zones more in the story, especially if they were writing 5 episodes without fully knowing its conclusion. It may have added some interest in the instead of the constantly being captured and breaking out storyline theme that they had going on. But one thing I will say is this story, it's not 12 parts, and I have no idea what I'm going to do when I get to that particular story. Maybe the same as what I've done here, who knows, but I will figure it out. That's what I think. Let me know what you think. Let me know what you think. Chat about it, don't shout about it. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye bye.